All right, folks. Well, thank you everyone for coming to this webinar this morning. This is the first webinar that Shannon and I are doing together, so we're really happy to have you here. Today, what we're talking about is the Ruby on Rails Community Survey 2020 edition. And I'm Kayla Reopelle. I have been working at Planet Argon for about a year and a half now, mostly as a Ruby on Rails developer, but also on some of our other applications that are more React based.
And I'm Shannon Jackson. I've been working at Planet Argon since October. I've been a developer for about 5 years, primarily in Rails, but I've also touched some PHP and Grails and .NET applications and a bunch of different things. So we decided that we could host this webinar going over some of the data that we got from the Rails survey. Also, we have access through crowdsource to being able to apply different filters and look at some things broken down a lot more. So we're hoping that we can really facilitate a lot more conversation based on some extra data that we're able to provide. We do want to have a quick disclaimer though. We are not data scientists. We are not statisticians. And the people who created this survey are neither of those things either. So if you see anything that you're like, I don't know if that's what that means, we know, and it's going to be a part of this this webinar as well, is figuring out where the gaps in that data are and what it says about our community, what it says about our survey, and trying to figure out how we can get better information both today and in the future.
And just a quick background on the survey before we go any further is that the Rails survey has been collected by Planet Argon since 2009, almost like biannually. And it started off, the reason why the website is called Rails Hosting is because at one point in time, Planet Argon had a Rails hosting business, and they were curious about getting information about how folks were using Rails to better create that. Planet Argon no longer has that service, but we enjoy connecting with the community and wanted to keep the survey alive.
Yeah, so the first thing that we wanted to talk about was where the Rails developers who responded to the survey work, because where you work influences how you work with Rails and what parts of the application you're working in, and it will really affect how you respond to this survey and the different questions there. So we wanted to give a quick rundown of sort of who responded. So if anybody is wondering, that doesn't sound like my situation at all, sort of to give you an idea of who was responding and how they were working with Rails. So as you can see, a very large chunk of our respondents work for product companies. The smallest amount are currently looking for work in Rails, and then the rest is divided pretty evenly between client work and freelancers or contractors. So let's look at that big chunk of product company people. So of them, we wanted to talk about their Rails experience. So as you can see, the smallest amount for them is the less than 1 year crowd, the people who've been working in Ruby or in Rails for less than a year. And then progressively, as you get more into mid-level and senior levels, that sort of evens out a lot, which kind of tracks with product companies. They want more senior developers who might mentor junior developers, but are not hiring junior developers at as high of a rate. They're about 70% of our respondents. This was just something that we put on all these slides, that Postgres is the most used in production developments for their databases. We also asked, if you're using Postgres, what would you like to use? And it's 90% of pretty much all respondents say, I would like to use Postgres. Then we also wanted to look at their community involvement. So product companies, only 35% are participating in community events, which is a pretty small number. And then when we're looking at the breakdown of front-end and UX developers and back-end DevOps developers, it's a pretty even split, slightly higher in the back-end DevOps space, but pretty even for all of their responses. And then we also wanted to ask sort of about how they feel about Rails in general, because we know, and we'll talk about this more later, how is Rails doing? Are we still popular? Are people still going to be using Rails in the future? It's going to be kind of a focus of this webinar. It's a focus of a lot of conversation in the community. So is Rails still relevant? 67% of product company workers totally agree. 24% mostly agree. So over 90% are generally positive. But I will say that at product companies, they have the lowest of totally agree. So 67% totally agreeing is actually the lowest of the chunks. Now let's talk about the freelance contractor folks. So here we get much more into the junior realm. There's a lot more juniors in freelancing and contracting than there were at the product companies. Mostly it's mid-level people. And 66% are using Postgres, over 90% want to. Only 33% are participating in events, so it's still a pretty low number. And again, almost 50-50 in terms of front-end UX and back-end DevOps. In terms of how they feel about the health of the Rails community and if it's still relevant, 79% totally agree. So this is actually the largest amount in terms of the positivity, the positive view of how Rails is going into the future. Agency work. So this is majority mid-level folks. 14% of our respondents, only 58% are using Postgres, and then 46% are participating in events. So agency folks are the ones that are participating the most in community events. Once again, almost 50-50, which is nice. And 70% totally agree. So we're still in a pretty positive space with the agency work. Next, we asked about the size of the development teams that you were working on. And this was the first question where we had some questions after we saw the results, because it's varied. So there's teams of 1, teams of 2 to 4, teams of 8 to 15 is not an insignificant number. So we realized that we work at an agency, and according to us, these numbers were surprising, but they definitely might not be surprising for everyone, depending on what kind of environment you work in, and also how you consider people to be on your team. So that's actually what we wanted to go into our first poll about. We're using the polls, especially in this webinar, to sort of figure out where the gaps in our questions were, and what the community is actually responding to when they're responding to our survey. So the first poll, which I'm going to have Kayla launch, is how you define the people on your development team. Is it anyone who's working at a developer at your company? Or is it anyone who's contributing to your specific application or project? If there's a different way that you define your development team, you can put it in the chat. We'd be curious to figure that out as well.
We'll give like another couple seconds. All right, closing the poll. So it looks like, at least for folks who are attending this webinar today, anyone who contributes to the specific application is generally how they define who's on their development team. So looking at people who are here today as a subset of folks who responded to the Rails survey, we can look, since there are also a lot of questions about, you know, how many applications are you working on and things like that as well. And it seems like most folks work on more than one Rails application who responded to the survey. It looks like the team definition is based on the group of folks who are working on the same application. That's pretty interesting. We also wanted to ask another poll in response to this data, which was, from what perspective did you fill out the Rails survey? As a professional, as a hobbyist, or both? There were a couple situations where we realized that these questions are very geared towards the professional experience, but being a member of the Rails community doesn't necessarily mean that you're working in it professionally. Okay, so right here, it looks like most folks responded to it as a professional. So the assumptions that we kind of made in the survey, it seems like, are how a lot of people did respond, but that isn't like exclusive to what's going on. As a hobbyist and as a professional, there are still a lot of crossovers in terms of tooling and things like that. But that's one area that we thought would have been interesting to filter the data through to see how hobby behavior and professionalist behavior is a little different. Oops, I didn't share those results. Now y'all can see it. All right, so we will get into the next part of our conversation.
Apologies for the screen. I know that from the survey results, a lot of people are tired of the "is Rails dead" conversation, and I get it. But a lot of the conversations happening after the survey, we're all sort of worried about this conversation as well. So once we released the survey results, we were looking through Twitter and LinkedIn and figuring out what people were responding to. And a lot of people had, were looking at the "how long have you been developing in Rails" question, where only 4% of our respondents said that they had been developing in Rails for less than 1 year. So we pulled out this tweet from Josh, who said that that's a troubling sign, that if there's 4% of people who are, where are the new people going? Where are the junior developers? Are they going to a different coding language? Does that mean that we're going to sort of dry out? So we decided to look deeper into the data to sort of figure out, what is true about those 4%, to try to figure out, where they're going, what's going on with them.
So when the first kind of filter we put on that data, when we were looking at, we wanted to see, okay, how did the folks learn how to code that responded saying that they have known Rails for less than 1 year? And we saw, that, okay, there's a lot of people who are self-taught and have a CS degree. They didn't learn from a boot camp, which was kind of surprising. At Planet Argon, a lot of our junior developers come from boot camps, so that didn't really connect with our experience. So then we kind of stepped into the next curious question about how many of these folks who have worked for less than 1 year, who also work at a product company, where did they learn how to code? And when we saw that a lot of these people, respondents, had been self-taught or had a CS degree, I kind of raised our eyebrows about what the question, how long have you been developing in Rails, actually means.
Yeah, so the answer to the why are only 4% of these people junior developers, it's actually worse than that. It's very possible that that 4% aren't even junior developers. So if it's product companies and it's people who have computer science degrees or are self-taught, there's a very high possibility, because of the nature of product companies, that that is people who knew how to code in a different language and got recruited over and then learned Rails. So they might be senior developers or upper mid-level developers who just have only been coding in Rails for less than 1 year, because that is the actual question that we asked. So we realized we don't have a good grasp of where new coders are, and we don't have a good idea of who responded to our survey. We know that that 4% isn't entirely junior developers. So that just means that we don't have that data in there anywhere. So we wanted to kind of clean that up with one of our polls and ask the actual question, which we thought we were asking when we said, how long have you been developing in Rails? So first, we're going to ask about how you learned Rails. So in relation to your total development experience, when did you learn Rails? Did you learn to code with Rails, or did you already know how to code and then you learned Rails? Also, we're kind of curious if you want to put in the chat, what languages did you learn in if you came to Rails later? So we'll give everyone a second to answer this one.
think everyone has been responding. So it looks like most folks who are attending this webinar today learned Rails after they were already familiar with another programming language. And only one person attending the webinar today learned how to code while learning Rails. For me personally, I learned how to code while learning Rails. I mean, I did focus on more Ruby first and then move into Rails, but Rails was part of my foundational development experience. And so I would have been one of the respondents that had responded probably like low in they learn how to code and have that expected response of being able to tell of those folks who have been developing with Rails for less than 1 year. Had I answered the survey in 2018, I would have been an accurate junior developer, but that might not be the case for everyone who responded.
Right. And I know that at my last company, we were recruiting Java developers all over the place, just because we were trying to find anyone who we thought could learn Rails, but still had that senior level of experience. So yeah, so with 88%, those people would be answering our poll and we would be falsely assuming that they were junior developers, and that is not true.
Which leads us to our next poll, which is how many years have you been a developer with any programming language? Since we didn't get that in quite that question, we're curious about how many folks responded as having come to Rails, or just how your experience matches up. And Thomas shared that he learned C, C++, and Java, and then learned Rails in 2005. Okay, so we'll give another 2 seconds for folks to respond to the poll. Okay, and it looks like of the attendees here today, the largest group has been a developer with any programming language for over 13 years, with the 4 to 6 and 1 to 3 year groups coming up as other, sizable representations. So this may be a question that we end up adding to the survey in the future, so that way we can get a grasp on how many new folks are coming to Rails, and also the previous poll about the total development experience and Rails to see how many people are learning Rails when they start to learn how to code. So these are just some insights that we got from digging into the data. All right, so our next section is we're wondering, where are the new developers going? I mean, that's kind of the other part of the coin of, is Rails dead? Are new developers coming to Rails? And what can we learn about new developers in this survey? From the perspective of a junior developer, looking through these questions, they're pretty hard to answer. We have some interns at Planet Argon right now who had just finished a boot camp and asked them to take a look over the survey, and they realized that they didn't have experience in a lot of the things that were coming up, and they wouldn't know how to answer them. And of course, you can skip questions, a lot of the questions in the survey, but we realized that could be it could be potentially hard or alienating to answer something like, how often do you contribute to open source projects? And have you authored at least one gem? In addition, someone might think, oh, this survey isn't for me if questions like this are on there, especially if you are learning how to code. Maybe this is too high of a bar, or something where the language isn't accessible enough for someone who is just fresh into Rails. Another point of view is that a junior developer might not be aware of the survey existing. This survey was out before Shannon and I worked at Planet Argon. It was out while we were junior developers, and we didn't know about it. We didn't respond to it. So is this maybe actually a question about us not getting the survey out to folks who are learning how to code, folks who are new to Rails, and it's a lot easier to get in touch with folks who are working for product companies or who have been developers for a longer period of time. The next thing that we wanted to look at is diving into how many years you've been developing with Rails, and seeing if that had changed over time. Maybe in 2016, we had a lot more folks who had that less than 1 year number, but in 2020, it was different. But that wasn't what we found. When we looked back into the old surveys, it seems pretty consistent that the same percentage of people from the same groups are responding to the survey, with the biggest change being folks who have been developing with Rails over 10 years, steadily increasing. So maybe that means we have a lot of return respondents who have been developing with Rails for a long time that are getting access to this survey and tracking the trends of their community as of their experiences as they spend more time working with Rails. But I'm feeling less concerned about having the less than 1 year developers accurately represented in this survey, just because it's been a solid, about 4% of respondents to the survey, no matter what year you look at, that are actually getting access to this content. So we have time for the next poll. I did not share the results of the previous poll. I'm sorry. It is a kind of confusing UI on when I share and when I don't share. So this is the information that we had collected before about how many years you had been a developer with any programming language. And as I had referenced, most of the folks here today have been a developer for over 13 years. The poll that we want to ask folks about now has more to do with what does self-taught mean? So a lot of the less than 1 year developers identified as self-taught, but self-taught can be a pretty big, wide open definition. When people say that they learned how to code through a boot camp or a CS degree program, we could do something like look up the number of programs that teach Rails to get a sense of how many people are learning in that way. And maybe, look at the attendees and things like that. But self-taught, we don't really know how to look that up or try to get another reference on that. So we wanted to ask you, what does self-taught mean to you in a development context? Feel free to check off as many boxes that meet your definition of self-taught. And also, if you have other definitions, add them in the chat. We're curious about what this self-taught definition means from your perspective.
Right, and even if it doesn't apply to you, but if you were in a hiring situation or if another developer on your team, they defined themselves as self-taught, what would you make an assumption about in terms of what that meant for that developer?
All right, we're going to close it in 3, 2, 1, done. Okay, so for the folks attending this webinar today, it seems like reading blogs and reading books is the biggest definition of what self-taught means. So maybe if we wanted to reference that data, we could look at readership of different Rails blogs and look at those numbers. That might also get a little muddled. Both of these things are things that developers who identify as maybe knowing the programming language would also reference. So I could see self-taught maybe just being one of those murkier things to try to understand by looking at other data. And yeah, learning through anything outside of a boot camp, or also building hobby projects for other pretty high ranking responses. I think that those kind of fall into what my definitions are generally for what self-taught means. Okay.
So we did want to talk a little bit about more of the front end questions as well, since we do have about a 50-50 response from front end and UX. So we were looking at how could we sort of compare ourselves and our survey, which we do acknowledge is like much more back end focused, to what the front end community is sort of interacting with. So we do have, we are able to compare to a similar survey that's within the JavaScript community called the State of JS. And that survey last happened in 2019. And so we decided to compare our results to those. So according to the Rails survey, the #1 JavaScript framework is jQuery, which was 31% of our respondents. 25% of our respondents were in React. According to the State of JS, 72% of the respondents to their survey said that they had used React and would use it again. If you're curious as to how many people responded about jQuery, they don't even ask about it anymore. They haven't asked about it since 2016. It's not even on their survey anymore. So that was kind of curious because it does make us seem like maybe the Rails community is a little behind on the times, because jQuery is not really considered popular with a lot of developers, especially front-end developers. But even I know a lot of Rails developers are pretty torn about that. There's some division there. So we wanted to ask a question. If you're still using jQuery in any of your applications, why haven't you switched to a more dynamic front-end framework? No judgment, pro or against jQuery, but what has kept you from upgrading to some of these, newer, flashier JavaScript front-end frameworks?
If you have been kept from it.
Yes.
And this is another one, answer as many as you feel apply. And if you have other reasons or things that you'd like to share about jQuery and Rails, please add them in the chat.
And we kind of based this off of one of our questions, which we'll talk about later, which was one of our questions was, why haven't you upgraded to the newest version of Rails? And I feel like the reasons why we don't upgrade are always very similar. I guess the difference would be that nobody's not upgrading from an older version of Rails because they love it, but they might be that case with jQuery.
So this is pretty interesting. No one loves it, or at least no one will commit today to saying that they love jQuery who is attending this webinar. The highest response was, my stakeholders don't think that it's a priority. And since this is multiple choice, people could have answered multiple of these, like, I don't think it's a priority as well. This is something that I think would be interesting to correlate to with just upgrades in general, like Shannon was saying. I don't know if jQuery is going to go away from the Rails community entirely anytime soon because it's so deep in some of our projects. But priorities in Rails and stakeholder priorities are something that also define trends, which could be another interesting thing to look at in future surveys. And this leads us to another question that we added to the survey this year, which is asking about the use of dual boots for upgrades. Now, we did realize that we don't exactly define what a dual boot is, but the majority of people said, I think that this is inverted, that they aren't using a dual boot instead of the folks that are using a dual boot for their upgrade strategy. For those of you who don't know what a dual boot is, a dual boot essentially adds a second gem file to a Rails application during an upgrade, so that way the repository can switch between the versions of Rails and the other dependencies that are running on production, and then the versions of the dependencies that the app will run on when it is finally upgraded. And you add a conditional throughout your code that kind of switches the environmental variable to say, all right, I want this code to fire based on the existing version of Rails, or I want this to fire based on the upgraded version of Rails, so that way all upgrade and non-upgrade related changes can coexist in the main branch. This is a strategy that there was a lot of discussion about from Shopify and GitHub, who recently upgraded from Rails 3.2 to running on Rails Edge or Rails Master, where they are continuously upgrading and always having this dual booting system set up to upgrade security patches, work and make commits to the actual Rails master branch and be part of that general upgrade team. So we weren't sure if this response was folks not knowing about it, folks who are maybe not doing an upgrade at all, and also maybe a dual boot isn't seen as accessible. There could be a lot of different reasons. From that information, we were also curious about looking over time about how the versions of Rails that you're using in your applications have changed for survey respondents from 2016, 2018, and 2020. Kind of the question by looking at the trends is, are folks upgrading their apps? Now, something that is also important to take a look at while we're seeing these numbers is the different release dates of Rails and of Rails versions and the release dates of the surveys. So Rails has been around for 16 years. Rails, 1.0 was released 16 years ago. So the number of folks that are on Rails 1 are very low. I think we still had maybe 1 or 2 respondents, but not very many. For 2016, the 2016 survey was released in June 2016. And that was also the same time that Rails 5.0 was released. So the fact that there were 8% that were running on it in beta mode when the survey was released is pretty interesting, especially considering how few people run on Rails Master and Edge pretty consistently throughout the survey results. In 2018, the survey was released in April, and in April 2018 was also when Rails 5.2 was released. So that's another time where the survey data collection and the survey release coincided with a Rails release. So the number of people who were using the latest version is perhaps understandably low, especially when we look at that data compared to 2020, where Rails 6 was released in August 2019. We haven't had a new minor version released yet, so this is still the latest version. And our 2020 survey was released in August of 2020. So it was almost a whole year after that version has been released. And we currently have 33% of the respondents who are running on Rails 6. It's also interesting to see that even the next lowest version has increased to 29% versus 24%. It's a little bit of a jump. And when we see 4.2 and below, this is getting steadily smaller, holding less and less of the share. And since there are still a sizable number of, oh, yes, Michael, you are correct. We should have had minus 11% there instead of plus 11%. Thank you for catching that. So we're also wondering that then, based on the folks who are using these different versions of Rails still today, why are the other 66% not running on Rails 6 yet, especially considering that it has been out for a year?
Yeah, and when we look at this chart, which is really interesting, the number one reasons why people are not upgrading to the newest version of Rails are time and priority, which makes a lot of sense from a developer perspective. As someone who has worked in contracts and SOWs and things like that, I would also like to bring up that budget, which is only marked as 13%. Budget is the same thing from a non-developer perspective as time and priority. So your time is the budget, your priority is based on the budget. So really from a developer perspective, we, especially depending on what kind of company you work for, the time and the priority might be what it looks like to you if you don't have to deal with contracts. But I know that we at a consultancy, we do have to think in terms of budget for our clients. And that's also why some of our projects don't get upgraded, because from that perspective, actually one of our interns, when they were looking at the survey results, said a quote that was, if you show me your budget, you show me your priorities. So those sort of ones all kind of get blocked together, which is we can't really afford to do that right now. And then if we look at the next one, after we look at, the budget of those things, it's tests. So 14% say like, we don't have the test coverage to upgrade to Rails and feel confident about it. So we kind of wanted to talk about those sorts of things in terms of maintainability and how you're upgrading and sort of how confident you feel when you're upgrading things.
And when we're looking at implementing, maybe a dual boot strategy for an upgrade, that's something that really requires you to have reliable test coverage throughout your application to judge against whether your changes are maybe breaking something in the existing version that's running on production or breaking something on the upgraded version. Tests are important there as well. So the poll that we wanted to ask folks in response to this question is, why would you prioritize an upgrade? Please select as many things that apply to you, and if you have other reasons, add them to the chat. We're curious about when it seems like it's time to upgrade.
Right. And for those of you who have not been given the budget or the time to upgrade, you can pay attention to this poll as to how to tell your product owners, I would like to do this sort of thing. because we as a community can talk about trends and preferences, but a lot of projects are sort of at the will of the budget and at the will of time. So we can say, you know, Rails 6 is the newest version, that's what we want, but we don't always get permission to upgrade our applications to Rails 6 in the amount, in the time that we would like to.
And we'll give, another 5 seconds for folks to respond. All right. So it seems like here, the biggest reason why folks would prioritize an upgrade would be protection from security vulnerabilities. It's a great reason. It's also a reason that a lot of stakeholders will agree to it too, at least in my example of speaking with folks at Planet Argon. Another big thing being having a strategy that allows new features to be released simultaneously and access to tools. Company having extra budget available kind of goes back to those stakeholder priorities that Shannon was talking about. So this is all pretty interesting in terms of why an upgrade would become a top priority. So now the last thing that we kind of wanted to close in our discussion about was automated perfection. We asked a couple questions about tools that we would generally identify as supporting the maintainability of an application. And the kind of question that got us thinking about this was, are you using an automated security tool like bundler-audit? We didn't have any other questions on the survey come out this clear in this split in the community between 50% yes and 50% no. And so of those folks who are using bundler-audit and who aren't using bundler-audit, are there any trends that we can see in terms of their approaches? The person who responded to this question on the actual survey website was a little alarmed by how many folks weren't using bundler-audit. So we wanted to see if we could draw anything from the rest of the data of questions about tools and maintainability to see where these groups fall. So this chart right here is showing if you answered none as the response to some of these tooling questions. So for example, one of the questions we asked was, which error tracking tool is your team using? And one of the options to respond to that question was none. And when we looked at pretty much every other metric in terms of bundler-audit in the community, whether it was working for a product company, being self-taught, or having a CS degree, it was almost like a freaky identical percentage number when we were breaking it down, which was so strange since it was a 50-50 split. The majority had authored at least one Rails gem. They feel confident in Rails security releases and use Rubocop, Sidekick, SimpleCov, RSpec, and an 80% test coverage is a goal. So when we look at none, responding to using none of these tools, we start to see the difference there, that folks who are not using bundler-audit are also more likely to not have any error tracking tools or performance monitoring tools or uptime monitoring tools or continuous integration tools that are used in their applications. So it seems like if you're not using bundler-audit, you are also way less likely to be using other tools. Now, why that happens, we're not exactly sure. I mean, this could be something that is a decision by company values in terms of automation. There could be different processes that someone has internally. It might not be set up in such a way, if you're not using continuous integration, to easily run something like bundler-audit or track the results of these monitoring tools and actually take action on them. So this is something that was just kind of curious and interesting, and maybe illuminates some differences in values on what makes a maintainable application, or what makes an application more maintainable to keep developing with it 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So for our final poll today, I would like to find out, what do you think makes your app maintainable? And please answer as many as apply, and add additional reasons in the chat if there's something that's missing. But what gives you confidence that when you're making a change, it's not going to break your application? or that your application is going to be long served without a need of a rewrite, even as you continue to push new changes.
Or for all the senior developers that are here, that you can one day retire and your application can be handed off to another person without having a breakdown.
So we'll give about 5 more seconds for folks to respond. April said in the chat that she's writing, or they're writing, I don't actually know your gender, April, that I'm writing hobby applications to teach myself Rails and they're not very maintainable. I think most of the applications I wrote while I was learning Rails, I would not identify as maintainable either, nor would Dependabot, as it continues to warn me about security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I get a lot of GitHub notifications about my code school applications having security vulnerabilities. Oh, lovely. Look at all that test coverage.
Yeah, so test coverage equals confidence, it seems like. And no one believes that their app has perfect code, so they don't need any of these things. But it's kind of, pretty varied across the board for the attendees of this webinar in terms of the other responses for what kinds of tools and things like that help give you confidence about the changes that you're making.
And we have about 15 minutes left, and we will get to some questions. Before we do, though, we did want to do a couple of plugs and let you know how you can get a hold of us going forward. So we did want to say that some of you may have found out about this webinar and the survey through the Maintainable Rails email list, but if you haven't, sign up. That's a weekly email from our CEO, Robbie Russell, who sends out tips about maintaining and upgrading your Rails applications, and also cleaning up technical debt, which I always find particularly useful. And then we also have a podcast, which is the Maintainable podcast. You can find it at maintainable.fm or any of your preferred podcast apps. A lot of conversations and interviews with people in the Rails community, both from development and management perspectives, keeping your apps maintainable and also keeping your teams maintainable and healthy, and how to improve your software's maintainability in general. And we're going to get to a lot of questions. We won't, unfortunately, be able to dive into the crowdsourced data and put different filters on things. But if you'd like us to, here's our Twitter. You can tweet at us at Planet Argon or use the hashtag Rails Survey 2020. We would love suggestions on, if you want to know how product companies responded to the JavaScript question, or how those less than 1 year people feel about dual boot strategy, anything like that. Tweet at us, let us know if any of these things brought up interesting stuff for you that you'd like us to look deeper into, or how we can improve on the Rails survey in the future, because we would really like to make it so that that data gets better and better every time.
Great. So any questions? It looks like we have one that's already in the chat. And I'll click this answer live button. So how did each of us learn how to code? I can start with answering for myself. I learned how to code by attending an online boot camp from the Flatiron School. And that process was based on, building a lot of apps, taking things that had broken tests and trying to resolve them, and also building a few different projects using Ruby, Sinatra, Rails, and React and Redux. And then lots of Stack Overflow on the job.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I learned at an in-person boot camp. I'm actually from Omaha, Nebraska, and we had a pretty robust Rails community there, especially when you're talking about 5-6 years ago, when Rails boot camps were sort of like at their peak, and there were a lot more of them than there are now. And I think that our survey results also, if you look at boot camp, the 3 to 7 year is like a much higher number. So that's sort of how I learned how to code. And we, similar to Kayla, we started in Ruby and then went into Rails. And a lot of that curriculum was focused on problem solving, because the instructors were like, you might not get a job in Rails. So I just want to teach you how to learn how to solve problems, and then we'll kick you out into the community and you can fall where you may. And so a lot of those, my fellow bootcamp people are working in .NET or Java, but a lot of us stayed in Rails because there are a lot of big product companies there. Greg asked, he wasn't able to attend the first half and wanted to know, did we discuss how difficult and time consuming it is to upgrade a Rails app? That is, why are we so concerned with time and budget and resources? That's a really good question. I think Kayla should answer this question. Planet Argon has been focusing a lot on trying to get people to upgrade their Rails applications. And she has been doing a lot of work on both trying to convince people to do it and giving like people really clear strategies for how to move forward on those.
Yeah, and I think, you know, why we have to be so concerned with it, that is something that the way, kind of a question we've been asking is internally is there a way to have Rails, you know, maybe start to have the dual booting strategy built into it so that you can start to look at how your tests compare to the next version so that you can maybe upgrade things more gradually. I'm not really aware of a lot of other programming languages in terms of upgrading their dependencies from major and minor versions. I mean, I've done like some basic node upgrades and haven't really run into issues. So it doesn't seem like it is an issue for all frameworks, languages, tools, and things like that. So I'm not exactly sure what the answer is there. But I think that the dual boot is maybe kind of the first step in that direction of trying to allow, I guess, that budget to be maybe less of a hindrance, because you're still needing to spend time, but you're not needing to spend exclusive time. So that maybe decreases the amount of investment that it seems like a stakeholder has, where it seems like their business can continue growing while they are also taking part of their funds to invest in the maintainability of their application. I think that's a great question, Greg, and I would be really curious to ask other folks that as well.
Yeah, we also had another question, which was, as a contractor or freelancer who takes over working on existing apps for clients, which I have done a lot of, and I know that Planet Argon has done a lot of, and they're working on older versions of Rails. What advice can you offer on how to pitch that to the client? So it's really hard to just say, like, you kind of need to do it. So I usually focus on maintainability of the application and security, especially as you get into older and older versions of Rails and you have a security issue with one of your gems. You might not be able to upgrade the gem if you don't upgrade the Rails version. And security is something that everyone kind of understands as a big issue, especially with all of the data leaks and things that have happened in the last few years. It's something that even a non-technical product owner can understand. And then the other one is that I usually use is that the older versions of things mean that you can't have the shiny, flashy stuff that you want, and it makes it harder to add new features. And it's ultimately more expensive if you have an older version of Rails to add new features, because your developers are struggling to kind of get around the version. So it might take them a lot longer to add a feature. Investing in that upgrade initially means that in the future, onboarding new people, adding new features, those sorts of things are going to go faster. So it is really just an investment in future features. And then similarly, what do you think is the largest hurdle in upgrading legacy apps in our experience?
For me, I would say that the largest hurdle, it kind of depends on the legacy app, right? Like if this is a legacy app in terms of the Martin Fowler definition, where it's maybe a large app with no tests, I'd say that is a huge hurdle, is trying to prepare the application to be upgraded so that way you're making sure that you're not losing any existing functionality, and you can also make it like an easier process in terms of QAing, because trying to ask folks to end-to-end QA and upgrade, when do you ask them to do that? What do you release first as an internal test, and to run that and then make sure that you're not undoing past work. I would say another really big hurdle is when you find legacy apps that are relying heavily on patched versions of gems and needing to make the decision of either refactoring how that gem is being used in the application or continuing to patch it for the new version. I've run into a few situations where I got to rewrite like old vendor plugins because they were really important to the core functionality of the application, and looking at trying to retrain the development team to use something else and remove it from everywhere that it was being called versus just adapting the code to work with another version of Ruby and Rails. That was more helpful. So actually maybe the hardest hurdle is trying to make a decision that will benefit your future self at every step of the way, and being intellectually mindful about what it is that you're doing and not getting caught up in, I need this to be finished, I need to move forward, and continuing to make, minute changes that are really sound and checking that they don't interfere with anything else. Shannon, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think consider your future self and like don't rush it are really, really, really good advice. And I think that those ones are really hard too, because if you had a lot of trouble convincing the product owner to go forward with that, you might be trying to keep like that's in the back of your mind and you're like, they don't want me to do this, so I shouldn't spend too much time on it. And ultimately that's going to bite you, and they will come back to you later and say, I thought that this was an investment in it being faster in the future. Another really good question that we got from Kenny is, how can we get more responses to the survey next year? Completely agree. The level of engagement from the senior Rails community, so that those 10 plus year developers, the ones who've been around almost since Rails started, they are the most likely to come to our webinar, to fill out our survey, to have those interactions. And how can we get those junior people? So now that we know that that's a huge gap, definitely the next time that we run this survey, we're going to target more junior developers, trying to get a wider range. And also something that we can do is be explicit about who's welcome to take the survey, who we want to take the survey. I feel, we were all junior developers at one point in time. And so it's very possible that you see something like this and you're like, oh yeah, like definitely when I know what I'm doing, I will respond to a Rails survey. And then you realize a couple years in that you never know what you're doing. So might as well respond early. Or having a separate survey that's just for junior developers that doesn't ask questions about deployment strategies and dual booting and those sorts of things that they might just not even know what those words mean yet. And that could also exclude them. And we always want to figure out, like, what is the purpose of the survey? What are we actually trying to figure out? And hearing from the junior developers is really valuable to us, because that's sort of where the future of Rails is coming from. Because if we only have senior Rails developers and we never get junior Rails developers, then we aren't going to have Rails developers in a couple of years.
And if folks also have other ideas about how to get the survey out to more folks the next time we release it, please let us know on Twitter. We're really open. Our goal is to connect with the community, and ideas on how to connect with the community are definitely appreciated, as we are Rails developers and we have excellent, talented marketing folks here too, but there's something about Rails developers knowing how to contact other Rails developers that we might not be able to guess. So.
Right. And sharing it, developers sharing it directly with more junior developers that you know, or if you have access to coding boot camps, saying to those people like, we really want you to fill this out. I know you, I think that you should do it. I think that those mentorship relationships and saying like, I explicitly think that you should do this is really helpful to more junior people and getting them to participate in those sorts of things.
That's all the questions we have right now. We still have a couple more minutes in case anyone else wants to jump in with another question.
Right.
And this is,
oh,
go for it.
We had a lot of questions about the upgrade strategy and a lot of responses on the survey. There are a couple of blog posts on the Planet Argon blog about the strategies that we've used to approach those sorts of things, but definitely reach out to us on Twitter. It's something that we're really passionate about as a company, and we would love to continue that conversation. Figuring out sort of how we can all get onto the latest version of Rails on our applications would be great. And yeah, and if you have any more data that you want us to dive deeper into, any follow-up questions, anything that we did not ask on the survey that you are really curious about, let us know. We put a lot of thought into these before we put them out, and we'd really like to make them better.
Great. Well, it seems like we don't have any more questions and we are almost out of time. So I really want to thank you all for coming and joining us today. It's been a pleasure to dive into this data and to get to share it with you. And, you know, appreciate everyone's interaction. It was really fun for me to see how folks were rating to some of these different polls and questions, and hope to see you more online and get your feedback on the next survey response. So yeah, and thank you too for all of the praise in the chat. We really appreciate your feedback and interaction. So yeah, I guess we'll sign off and we'll close the webinar. Thanks folks, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks everybody.